Chen had been pouring coffee and serving pie at Maple Grove Diner for 7 years. But nobody in the sleepy town of Millbrook knew she could kill a man with her bare hands in under 30 seconds. The locals saw her as nothing more than a friendly face behind the counter, always ready with a warm smile and their usual order. They had no idea that the woman who remembered how they liked their eggs had once been the most lethal operative. In a program so classified it didn't officially exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But secrets have a way of catching up with you, especially when you're hiding in plain sight. The morning sun filtered through the faded yellow curtains of Maple Grove Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered linoleum floor that had seen better decades. Chen moved with practiced efficiency between the coffee machine and the grill, her movements fluid and precise in a way that might have seemed unremarkable to the casual observer. But there was something different about how she carried herself, a controlled grace that belonged more to a dancer or perhaps a martial artist than a small-town waitress. She had arrived in Millbrook 7 years ago with nothing but a battered suitcase and a story about needing a fresh start after a messy divorce. The locals had welcomed her with the kind of cautious warmth that small towns reserve for newcomers, who might stick around long enough to become part of the fabric of the community. Sarah had proven her worth quickly, showing up early, staying late, and never complaining about the difficult customers or the long hours. The diner itself was a relic from the 1950s, with red vinyl booths that had been patched more times than anyone could count, and a jukebox that played the same 15 songs on endless repeat. The walls were covered with photographs of local high school football teams, family reunions, and the occasional celebrity who had passed through town on their way to somewhere more important. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip traveled faster than the morning coffee, and where secrets were as rare as snow in July. Sarah had chosen Millbrook precisely because it was unremarkable. The town of 4,000 people sat in the middle of farm country, surrounded by cornfields and pastures that stretched to the horizon. The nearest city was 2 hours away by car, and the most exciting thing that had happened in recent memory was when the high school football team made it to the state playoffs 3 years ago. It was the perfect place to disappear, to become someone new, to leave behind a past that was too dangerous to remember. But Sarah remembered everything. She remembered the training facility in the mountains of Colorado where she had learned to speak 7 languages fluently and to kill in twice as many ways. She remembered the missions that had taken her to places that didn't appear on any map, where she had done things that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. She remembered the day she had walked away from it all, when the cost of serving her country had finally become too high for her conscience to bear. The bell above the diner's front door chimed its familiar greeting as the first customers of the day began to arrive. Tom Bradley, the town's mail carrier, shuffled in with his usual hangdog expression and took his customary seat at the counter. He had been coming to the diner every morning for the past 15 years, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, and scrambled eggs. Sarah had his order started before he even sat down. "Morning, Tom," she said, sliding a steaming mug across the counter. "How's Martha feeling today?" Tom's wife had been battling pneumonia for the past 2 weeks, and Sarah made it a point to ask about her every morning. It was the kind of small-town courtesy that came naturally to her now, though it had taken years to perfect the art of caring about people's everyday problems, when her mind was trained to think in terms of national security and global threats. "Better, thanks for asking," Tom replied, wrapping his weathered hands around the mug. "Doctor says she should be back on her feet by the weekend." Sarah nodded and moved on to the next customer, a young mother named Lisa who came in every Tuesday with her twin toddlers. The boys were energetic and loud, but Sarah had long ago learned to navigate around them with the kind of situational awareness that had once kept her alive in hostile territory. She could serve their table while simultaneously monitoring the kitchen, tracking the movements of every other customer, and noting the unusual number of black sedans that had been parked along Main Street for the past 3 days. The sedans were the first sign that her carefully constructed new life was beginning to unravel. They were too clean, too expensive, and too deliberately inconspicuous for a town where the newest car on the lot was a 2-year-old pickup truck. Sarah had noticed them immediately, her training kicking in despite 7 years of trying to forget everything she had learned. She had cataloged their license plates, noted the tinted windows, and observed the way they moved through town in carefully coordinated patterns. She told herself it was probably nothing. Maybe some government officials were in town for a routine inspection of the grain elevator, or perhaps a team of investigators was looking into the string of farm equipment thefts that had been plaguing the county. But deep down, she knew better. The movements were too precise, too professional, too familiar. They belonged to people who had been trained in the same schools she had attended, who had learned the same lessons about surveillance and counter-surveillance. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself falling into old habits. She positioned herself behind the counter where she could see both the front door and the kitchen entrance. She kept track of every customer who entered and left, noting their faces, their clothing, their behavior. She checked the locks on the back door 3 times and made sure the emergency exit was clear of obstacles. It was muscle memory from a life she had tried to leave behind, but her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget. The lunch rush brought its usual collection of farmers, retirees, and traveling salesmen. Sarah knew most of them by name, knew their stories, their families, their problems. There was Jim Patterson, whose corn crop had been devastated by the early frost. There was elderly Mrs. Henderson, who came in every day since her husband had passed, just to have someone to talk to. There was Danny Morrison, fresh out of high school and full of big dreams about escaping to the city. Sarah served them all with the same warm smile and attentive service that had made her a favorite among the locals. She laughed at their jokes, listened to their complaints, and remembered their preferences. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But underneath the surface, she was calculating distances to exits, identifying potential weapons, and planning escape routes. The skills she had learned in another life were reasserting themselves, triggered by the presence of those black sedans, and the growing certainty that her past was about to collide with her present. The afternoon brought an unusual customer, a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military service. He ordered coffee and apple pie, paid in cash, and sat in the corner booth with a clear view of the street. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Law enforcement, probably federal, definitely experienced. He was trying to blend in, but his eyes were too alert, his posture too rigid, his choice of seating too strategic. She served him with the same friendly efficiency she showed all her customers, but she was careful not to let her recognition show. Instead, she engaged him in the kind of small talk that was expected in a place like Maple Grove Diner, asking about the weather and whether he was passing through or staying in town. He answered politely but vaguely, claiming to be a traveling insurance adjuster looking into a claim at one of the local farms. Sarah didn't believe him for a second. Insurance adjusters didn't move with that kind of controlled precision, didn't have that particular look in their eyes that came from years of dangerous work. This man was a professional, and his presence in her diner was no coincidence. She began to wonder if the other customers were what they seemed, if the familiar faces she had been serving for 7 years were still familiar, or if some of them had been replaced by operatives who had studied their mannerisms and learned to mimic their routines. Paranoia was an occupational hazard of her former profession, but Sarah had learned to trust her instincts. They had kept her alive through missions that had killed other operatives, had helped her navigate the treacherous waters of international espionage, had warned her when it was time to disappear. Now those same instincts were screaming at her that something was wrong, that the careful life she had built in Millbrook was about to come crashing down around her. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed more signs that her cover was blown. The usual delivery trucks were arriving at different times, their drivers unfamiliar faces who seemed more interested in the diner than in making their deliveries. The phone had rung several times with hang-ups, and she had caught glimpses of people with cameras across the street, trying to look like tourists but failing to disguise their professional interest in the building. She began to make preparations, moving with the same casual efficiency that had characterized her morning routine, but now with an edge of urgency that only someone with her training would recognize. She checked the cash register, noting how much money was available if she needed to make a quick exit. She mentally cataloged the contents of her small apartment above the diner, deciding what was essential and what could be left behind. She reviewed her escape routes, the ones she had memorized during her first week in town, but had never expected to use. The hardest part was maintaining her facade. She continued to serve customers, to smile and chat and behave like nothing had changed. But inside, she was already saying goodbye to the life she had built, to the relationships she had formed, to the sense of peace she had found in this small town, where the biggest crisis was usually a shortage of pie, filling, or a broken coffee machine. As the dinner crowd began to arrive, Sarah found herself looking at each customer with new eyes. Were they really the people she had been serving for 7 years, or were they something else entirely? Had Tom Bradley really been a mail carrier all this time, or was he part of an elaborate surveillance operation? Was Mrs. Henderson truly a lonely widow, or was she a retired operative keeping tabs on a former colleague who had tried to disappear? The questions multiplied in her mind, each one adding to the growing certainty that her time in Millbrook was coming to an end. She had always known this day might come, had always been prepared for the possibility that her past would catch up with her. But she had hoped for more time, had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could stay hidden forever in this sleepy town where nothing ever happened. The evening light was fading when Sarah noticed the helicopter. It was flying low, making what appeared to be a routine patrol, but she recognized the distinctive sound of military rotors. She stepped outside under the pretense of checking the weather, and watched as it circled the town twice before disappearing to the north. It was a reconnaissance flight, she was certain, mapping the area and identifying potential landing sites. Back inside the diner, Sarah continued her routine, but her mind was racing. She had perhaps hours, maybe less, before whatever was coming would arrive. She needed to decide whether to run or to stay and face whatever consequences her past had brought to her doorstep. Running would mean abandoning everything she had built, but staying might mean putting innocent people at risk. The last customer of the evening was a young couple passing through town on their way to visit family. They were clearly in love, clearly happy, clearly oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that had been building throughout the day. Sarah served them with extra care, taking pleasure in their obvious joy, knowing that she might not have many more opportunities to witness such simple, uncomplicated happiness. As she cleaned the kitchen and prepared to close the diner, Sarah made her decision. She would stay, at least for tonight. She would face whatever was coming, would deal with the consequences of her choices, would protect the people of Millbrook as best she could. She had run away once, 7 years ago, but she was older now, wiser, and tired of running. Whatever had brought those black sedans to her small town, whatever had prompted that reconnaissance flight, she would meet it head on. The diner was quiet now, the last customer gone, the doors locked, the lights dimmed. Sarah stood behind the counter, looking out at the empty street, at the town that had become her home. She thought about the woman she had been before she came to Millbrook, about the missions and the training and the skills that had been drilled into her until they became second nature. She thought about the woman she had become, the one who knew everyone's coffee preferences and remembered their birthdays and worried about their problems. Both women were real, both were her, and tomorrow she would need to be both of them if she was going to survive whatever was coming. She had tried to leave her past behind, but the past, it seemed, had finally found her. The question now was whether she was ready to face it, whether she was prepared to be the person she had tried so hard to forget. Sarah Chen had been hiding in plain sight for 7 years, but tomorrow, she suspected, the hiding would be over. The small-town waitress who poured coffee and served pie was about to remember that she had once been something else entirely. Something dangerous, something that apparently couldn't be allowed to remain hidden forever. As she climbed the stairs to her small apartment above the diner, Sarah began to plan. She reviewed her options, considered her resources, and prepared for the possibility that her carefully constructed new life was about to become a battlefield. She had hoped that her war was over, but wars, she had learned, have a way of following you home. The night was quiet, but Sarah Chen couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the small town. Around her, the distant hum of the grain elevator, the occasional car passing on the highway, the soft whisper of wind through the maple trees that gave the diner its name. These were the sounds of peace, of normalcy, of a life far removed from the violence and danger that had once defined her existence. But underneath those familiar sounds, Sarah could hear something else. The subtle vibration of helicopters in the distance, too far away for most people to notice, but unmistakable to someone with her training. They were coming, and they were coming for her. The woman who had once been known by a code name that struck fear into the hearts of international terrorists closed her eyes and began to remember. She remembered the training, the missions, the skills that had made her one of the most effective operatives in a program that officially didn't exist. She remembered why she had walked away, why she had chosen to disappear, why she had tried to become someone else. But most of all, she remembered that some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried forever, and that sometimes the past refuses to stay in the past. Sarah Chen was about to learn that lesson the hard way, in front of the entire town of Millbrook, in a confrontation that would change everything she thought she knew about her new life and her old enemies. The small-town waitress was about to become someone else entirely, and the sleepy town of Millbrook was about to discover that their friendly neighbor had been hiding a deadly secret that would bring the full force of the United States military to their quiet Main Street. The reckoning was coming, and Sarah Chen was as ready as she could be for whatever tomorrow would bring. The pre-dawn darkness was broken by the low rumble of engines that didn't belong in Millbrook. Sarah had been awake since 3 in the morning. Her internal clock calibrated by years of missions that began before sunrise. She stood at her apartment window, carefully positioned behind the curtain where she could observe without being seen. The vehicles were moving in a coordinated pattern through the town's outskirts, their headlights cutting through the morning fog like surgical instruments. She counted them methodically. 12 vehicles total, arranged in 3 separate convoys, approaching from different directions. The coordination was flawless, the timing precise. This wasn't a random investigation or a routine federal sweep. This was a full-scale operation, planned and executed by people who understood exactly what they were dealing with. Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced before every high-stakes mission in her former life. The kitchen of Maple Grove Diner had never felt smaller as Sarah moved through her morning routine. Every action was deliberate now, every movement calculated. She started the coffee machine exactly as she had for 7 years, but her fingers lingered on the industrial-grade equipment in a way they never had before. The commercial coffee grinder could be weaponized in skilled hands. The cast-in skillet, Hanging above the stove had the weight and balance of a medieval mace. Even the sharp carving knives in their magnetic holder seemed to call to muscle memory she had tried to suppress. The first customer arrived at 5:30, just as the diner's neon sign flickered to life in the growing dawn. It should have been Pete Richardson, the night shift supervisor from the grain elevator, who always stopped for coffee and a breakfast burrito before heading home. Instead, it was a woman Sarah had never seen before, middle-aged with prematurely gray hair and the kind of unremarkable features that made her instantly forgettable. She ordered black coffee and sat in the booth with the best view of both entrances, her eyes constantly scanning the street outside. Sarah served the coffee with her usual smile, but her trained eye cataloged everything about the woman. The slight bulge under her left arm that suggested a shoulder holster. The way she held her coffee cup with her non-dominant hand, keeping her right hand free. The subtle earpiece that was almost completely hidden by her hair. This was federal law. Enforcement, probably FBI, or maybe something more specialized. The morning proceeded like a carefully choreographed dance between predator and prey, though it remained unclear who was which. More unfamiliar faces appeared among the usual customers, each one trying to blend in but failing to fool someone with Sarah's background. The supposed traveling salesman who ordered pancakes but barely touched them while maintaining constant radio contact through a throat mic. The elderly gentleman who claimed to be visiting family but whose shoes were military-issue combat boots, disguised with civilian polish. Tom Bradley arrived at his usual time, shuffling through the door with his mailbag slung over his shoulder. But something was different about his routine. He sat in a different booth, one that gave him a clear line of sight to the kitchen entrance. His usual friendly chatter was replaced by terse professional observations about the weather and the wear. Unusual amount of traffic on the highway. When Sarah brought his coffee, she noticed his hands were steadier than they had ever been, and his eyes held an alertness that belonged to someone much younger and far more dangerous. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Tom Bradley wasn't just a mail carrier who had been replaced by an operative. He had always been an operative, had been watching her for 7 years, had been part of an elaborate surveillance operation that stretched back to the day she first arrived in Millbrook. The friendly local who had welcomed her to town, who had asked about her background with seemingly innocent curiosity, who had become part of the fabric of her daily routine, had been reporting on her activities all along. Sarah's mind raced through 7 years of interactions, re-examining every conversation, every shared moment, every small kindness that had made her feel like she belonged in this community. How many of them had been real? How many of the people she had come to care about were exactly who they claimed to be? The elderly widow who came in every day for company, the young mother with the twin boys, the high school kid with dreams of escaping to the city. Were any of them genuine? Or had her entire life in Millbrook been an elaborate stage production designed to keep her contained and monitored? The breakfast crowd grew heavier than usual, filled with faces that were almost familiar but not quite right. Sarah recognized the technique. They had studied the real locals, learned their mannerisms and preferences, and now they were playing their roles with the kind of precision that only came from extensive preparation. But they couldn't replicate 7 years of genuine relationships, couldn't fake the small intimacies that developed between people who saw each other every day. Mrs. Henderson arrived at 9 o'clock, taking her usual seat by the window. She ordered her standard breakfast of oatmeal with brown sugar and a cup of tea with honey, just as she had every morning for the past 4 years. But when Sarah brought the order, the woman who had claimed to be a lonely widow made a mistake that revealed everything. She thanked Sarah in perfect Mandarin, using a dialect that was specific to a particular region of northern China where Sarah had once spent 3 months on a covert operation. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with terrifying clarity. The entire town hadn't been replaced overnight. Some of the surveillance had been in place for years, maybe from the very beginning. Her arrival in Millbrook hadn't been the random choice she had believed it to be. She had been guided. Here, manipulated into choosing this particular town, this particular diner, this particular life. The sense of safety and normalcy she had treasured for 7 years had been an illusion, carefully maintained by people who wanted her to believe she was hidden when she was actually under constant observation. The lunch rush brought new players to the game. A family of tourists with out-of-state plates stopped for directions and ended up ordering lunch. The father was clearly military, his haircut regulation short despite his civilian clothes. The mother kept glancing at her watch with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was waiting for a specific time. Their 2 children were too well-behaved, too quiet, too obviously trained to sit still and observe rather than fidget and complain like normal kids on a long car trip. Sarah began to understand the scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about her. The entire operation was designed to look like a routine day in a small town, but it was actually a massive deployment of resources. The cost of maintaining this level of surveillance for 7 years would have been enormous, requiring approval from the highest levels of government. Whatever she had done in her former life, whatever secrets she possessed, they were valuable enough to justify an operation of unprecedented scale and duration. The afternoon brought visitors who didn't even pretend to be locals. A team of what appeared to be utility workers began setting up equipment near the power lines behind the diner. They wore the right uniforms and carried the right tools, but their movements were too coordinated, too tactical. Sarah recognized the signs of a communications interception team, the kind of specialists who could monitor every phone call, every internet connection, every electronic signal within a 5-mile radius. A second team arrived in an unmarked van, claiming to be conducting a survey for a new cell phone tower. They began setting up sophisticated equipment on the roof of the building across the street, equipment that looked nothing like standard telecommunications gear. Sarah had seen similar setups before, in hostile territories where her handlers needed to maintain constant contact with operatives in the field. This was command and control infrastructure, the kind of setup that preceded major operations. The pressure was building like water behind a dam, and Sarah could feel the inevitable moment when everything would break open. She continued her routine, serving customers and maintaining her facade, but every instinct she possessed was screaming warnings. The operatives were getting more obvious, less concerned about maintaining their cover. That could only mean one thing: the operation was moving into its final phase, and subtlety was no longer necessary. At 3 o'clock, the school bus arrived to drop off children from the local elementary school. But instead of the usual chaos of kids running to the candy counter for after-school treats, there was an eerie quiet. The children walked in orderly lines, accompanied by adults who weren't their usual parents or teachers. Sarah recognized the signs of an evacuation disguised as a field trip. The real residents of Millbrook were being moved to safety, replaced by professionals who could handle whatever was about to happen. The realization that innocent people were being protected, even as the net closed around her, brought Sarah a moment of unexpected relief. Whatever her crimes, whatever secrets she possessed, the people planning this operation weren't willing to risk civilian casualties. That suggested military rather than intelligence community leadership, which meant there might still be rules of engagement, still be limits to what they were willing to do to bring her in. But it also meant they expected resistance. You don't evacuate civilians unless you're planning for violence, unless you believe the target might fight back with deadly force. Sarah wondered what version of her story they had been told, what narrative had been constructed to justify this massive deployment of resources. Did they see her as a traitor who had sold secrets to foreign governments? A rogue operative who had gone off the rails? A terrorist cell of one, hiding in plain sight while planning devastating attacks? The truth was more complicated than any of those possibilities, but Sarah wasn't sure anyone would believe it, even if she had the chance to explain. The program she had been part of existed in the shadows between legitimate military operations and outright illegal activities. The missions she had completed were necessary for national security, but could never be officially acknowledged. Navy SEALs, just as the operation had promised. She counted 12 operators from the first helicopter, each one moving with the kind of controlled aggression that marked them as the best of the best. A second helicopter touched down in the street, itself blocking all vehicle traffic in either direction. More SEALs emerged from this one, but these moved differently, with the careful deliberation of a command team rather than assault specialists. Sarah recognized the configuration immediately. Capture, not kill. They wanted her alive, which meant they needed something from her that couldn't be extracted from a corpse. The third helicopter remained airborne, circling the immediate area like a mechanical vulture. Sarah could see the snipers positioned at its open doors, their rifles equipped with scopes that could put a bullet through a target's eye at 500 yards. The message was clear. Any attempt to flee would be met with immediate and lethal force. They had planned for every contingency, covered every angle, anticipated every possible escape route. The fake customers in the diner had dropped their pretense entirely now, revealing themselves as the advance team they had always been. The supposed traveling salesman produced a military-grade radio and began coordinating with the incoming forces. The elderly gentleman who had claimed to be visiting family pulled out a tablet computer and began displaying what appeared to be detailed floor plans of the diner. Even the family of tourists had transformed, the parents taking defensive positions while their unnaturally well-behaved children began setting up what looked like signal jamming equipment. Sarah realized that every person in the diner had been placed there specifically for this moment. They weren't just surveillance operatives. They were part of a capture team that had been rehearsing this operation for months, possibly years. Every detail had been planned, every variable accounted for, every potential resistance neutralized before it could begin. The level of preparation was staggering. The kind of resource allocation that suggested this operation had been authorized at the highest levels of government. The front door of the diner exploded inward as the first SEAL team made their entrance. They moved like liquid death, flowing around obstacles with practiced efficiency, their weapons trained on Sarah with unwavering precision. She raised her hands slowly, making no sudden movements that might trigger a nervous finger on a hair trigger. These men were professionals, but they were also human, and humans made mistakes when they were scared or surprised. The team leader was a compact man with steel-gray eyes and the kind of scars that told stories of battles fought in places that didn't appear on any map. He approached the counter with his weapon lowered but ready, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Agent Phoenix," he said, using a code name that Sarah hadn't heard spoken aloud in 7 years. "You are under arrest by order of the Joint Special Operations Command. You will come with us quietly, or we will take you by force. The choice is yours." Agent Phoenix. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow, dragging up memories she had spent years trying to suppress. That wasn't who she was anymore. That person had died the day she walked away from her final mission, buried under 7 years of small town normalcy and genuine human connection. But apparently, some people refuse to let the dead rest in peace. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the weapons pointed at her from 6 different angles. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm just a waitress. I've been working here for 7 years. Ask anyone in town." The team leader smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "We have been asking, Agent Phoenix. We've been asking for 7 years. Did you really think we wouldn't find you? Did you honestly believe you could disappear forever?" One of the fake customers, The woman who had claimed to be Mrs. Henderson stepped forward and removed what Sarah now realized was an elaborate mask. Underneath was a face Sarah recognized, though it belonged to someone she had hoped never to see. Again, Director Catherine Walsh, the woman who had run the program that had created Agent Phoenix, who had given the orders that Sarah had ultimately refused to follow. "Hello, Phoenix," Walsh said, her voice carrying the same cold professionalism that had characterized their relationship during Sarah's active years. "You've led us quite a chase. 7 years of playing house in this charming little town. Did you enjoy your vacation from reality?" Sarah felt the last of her carefully constructed identity crumbling away like a house built on sand. The director's presence here meant this wasn't just about bringing in a rogue operative. This was personal, a settling of accounts that had been 7 years in the making. Walsh had never forgiven betrayal, had never forgotten those who dared to question her authority. "I'm not Agent Phoenix anymore," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "That person died a long time ago. I'm just Sarah Chen now. I serve coffee and pie. I remember people's birthdays. I worry about their problems. I'm nobody special." Walsh laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Nobody special? You killed 17 enemy agents in a single night in Prague. You infiltrated the most secure facility in North Korea and walked out with intelligence that prevented a nuclear war. You are many things, Phoenix, but nobody special is not one of them." The memories came flooding back despite Sarah's efforts to keep them buried. Prague had been a nightmare, a mission that had gone wrong from the first moment she stepped off the plane. The enemy had been waiting for her, had known she was coming, and she had fought her way through them with a combination of skill, desperation, and pure luck. 17 kills in 6 hours, each one a person with a name and a family and dreams. That would never be fulfilled. North Korea had been different. A solo infiltration mission that had required her to become someone else entirely for 3 months. She had worked as a translator at a government facility, slowly gathering intelligence about their nuclear program while maintaining perfect cover. The information she had smuggled out had indeed prevented a war, but the cost had been the lives of 6 North Korean citizens who had helped her, people who had trusted her and paid for that trust with their lives. Those missions were necessary, Sarah said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "People were going to die if I didn't act. I saved lives." "Yes, you did," Walsh agreed. "Which is why your subsequent betrayal was so disappointing. You were the best operative we ever trained, Phoenix. You could have been a legend. Instead, you chose to become a traitor." The word hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with implications and accusations. Traitor. It was the one crime that could never be forgiven, never be overlooked, never be forgotten. In the world Sarah had inhabited as Agent Phoenix, there were no retirement plans, no resignation letters, no graceful exits. There was only service until death or betrayal, followed by execution. "I didn't betray anyone," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she remembered why she had walked away. "I refused to murder innocent people. I refused to become an assassin for hire. That's not betrayal, that's conscience." Walsh's expression hardened, and Sarah saw the true reason for this elaborate operation. It wasn't about bringing in a rogue operative or recovering stolen intelligence. It was about proving a point, about demonstrating that no one, no matter how skilled or how well hidden, could defy Director Catherine Walsh and live to tell about it. "The target list was classified at the highest levels," Walsh said. "You didn't have the clearance to make moral judgments about operational necessity. Your job was to follow orders, not to question them." Sarah remembered the list, 12 names of people who had been marked for elimination. The official justification had been national security, but her own investigation had revealed a different truth. They were all people who had been asking questions about the program, journalists who had gotten too close to classified operations, Officials who had demanded accountability for activities that couldn't be officially acknowledged. They were innocent people, Sarah said. They were doing their jobs, trying to uncover the truth about illegal activities. Killing them wouldn't have protected national security. It would have protected you and your program from exposure. The SEAL team. Leaders shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah realized that he and his men probably didn't know the full story. They had been told they were capturing a dangerous traitor, a rogue operative who posed a threat to national security. They had no idea they were being used to settle a personal vendetta, to clean up evidence of illegal activities that should have been exposed years ago. Walsh noticed the team leader's reaction and moved quickly to regain control of the narrative. Agent Phoenix stole classified intelligence and disappeared with information that could compromise ongoing operations. She has been in contact with foreign agents, selling secrets to the highest bidder. This operation is about protecting national security, nothing more. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the lie, but she also recognized the tactical brilliance of it. Walsh had created a story that would justify any level of force, any violation of civil rights, any action necessary to bring in the supposed traitor. The SEALs would follow their orders without question, because they believed they were protecting their country from a genuine threat. "That's a lie," Sarah said, looking directly at the team leader. "I haven't contacted anyone from my former life. I haven't sold any secrets. I've been serving coffee and pie for 7 years. Check my phone records, my internet history, my bank accounts. I'm exactly who I appear to be." The team leader's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but his training kept his weapon steady. He had been given a mission, and personal doubts wouldn't interfere with his professional obligations. But Sarah could see that Walsh's story didn't quite add up for him, that the woman behind the counter didn't match his mental image of a dangerous traitor. Walsh pulled out a tablet computer and began displaying what appeared to be classified documents. Phoenix has been in contact with Chinese intelligence services for the past 3 years. She has provided them with detailed information about our operations in Southeast Asia, compromising multiple ongoing missions and causing the deaths of at least 6 American operatives. Sarah stared at the documents in horror. They were expertly forged, containing just enough real information to be convincing while painting her as exactly the kind of traitor Walsh needed her to be. The communications were backdated, the bank transfers were hidden in accounts she had never opened. The intelligence reports contained details that only someone with her level of access could have known. "Those are fabricated," Sarah said, but she could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. "I've never contacted Chinese intelligence. I've never betrayed my country. This is all a setup." Walsh smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Prove it. Prove that you didn't send these communications, didn't receive these payments, didn't provide this intelligence. How does an innocent waitress disprove evidence of treason?" Sarah realized with growing horror that this had been the plan all along. Walsh hadn't just spent 7 years hunting for her. She had spent 7 years building a case against her. Every day of her peaceful life in Millbrook had been another day for Walsh to construct an elaborate frame job, to create evidence of crimes that had never been committed, to justify actions that could never be officially acknowledged. The director had learned from Sarah's original escape. This time, there would be no walking away, no disappearing into a new identity, no finding peace in a small town where nobody asked inconvenient questions. This time, Sarah would be brought in as a confirmed traitor, tried in a secret tribunal, and executed as an enemy of the state. Walsh would have her revenge, and the program would be protected from anyone who might consider following Sarah's example. "You want to know the truth?" Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension in the diner like a blade. "The truth is that Director Walsh ran an illegal assassination program. She ordered the murders of American citizens who threatened to expose her activities. When I refused to carry out those murders, she branded me a traitor to cover up her own crimes. The SEAL team leader looked between Sarah and Walsh, uncertainty clear in his expression. His mission briefing had been simple: capture a dangerous traitor. But the woman in front of him didn't seem dangerous, and the accusations she was making painted a very different picture than the one he had been given. Walsh's mask of professional composure slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury underneath. Agent Phoenix is a trained liar and manipulator. She will say anything to avoid facing justice for her crimes. Don't let her psychological warfare tactics confuse the mission. But Sarah could see that doubt had been planted. The team leader was a professional, but he was also a patriot who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. If there was even a possibility that he was being used to cover up illegal activities, he would want to know the truth. "Ask her about the Blackwater files," Sarah said, using information she had hoped never to reveal. "Ask her about Operation Cleanup. Ask her about the 12 American citizens who were marked for assassination because they got too close to the truth about what the program was really doing." Walsh's face went pale, and Sarah knew she had hit the target. The Blackwater files were the smoking gun, the documented evidence of the program's illegal activities that Sarah had discovered during her investigation of the target list. She had never stolen them, never used them as leverage, but their existence was the real reason Walsh could never let her live. "I don't know what she's talking about," Walsh said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "These are the desperate lies of a cornered traitor." The team leader lowered his weapon slightly, his tactical training warring with his growing doubts about the mission. "Ma'am, perhaps we should verify this intelligence before proceeding with the capture." Walsh's mask slipped entirely, revealing the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed plan was beginning to unravel. "You have your orders, Commander. Agent Phoenix is a confirmed traitor who poses an immediate threat to national security. Take her into custody now." Sarah realized that this was her moment, the brief window of confusion and doubt that might allow her to escape or at least ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. She had spent 7 years trying to forget the skills that had made her Agent Phoenix, but those skills were still there, buried under layers of normalcy and carefully constructed peace. "Commander," she said, addressing the team leader directly, "I'm going to reach into my apron pocket and pull out something that will prove everything I've just told you. I'm not reaching for a weapon. I'm reaching for the truth." The SEAL tensed, his weapon coming back up to full readiness. Sarah moved slowly, telegraphing every motion as she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small flash drive that had been hidden there for 7 years. She had hoped never to use it, had prayed that it would remain her secret insurance policy forever. But sometimes the past demanded payment in full. "This contains copies of the Blackwater files," she said, holding the drive where everyone could see it. "It contains documented proof of Director Walsh's illegal activities, including the order to assassinate 12 American citizens. Upload this to any secure government server, and you'll have the truth about who the real traitor is." Walsh lunged forward, her carefully maintained professional demeanor completely abandoned. Don't let her upload anything. She could be transmitting intelligence to enemy agents. But the team leader was no longer taking orders from Walsh. His training had taught him to recognize truth from lies, and everything about this situation had been wrong from the beginning. He stepped between Walsh and Sarah, his weapon now pointed at the director instead of the supposed traitor. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back while we verify this intelligence," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just realized he might be on the wrong side of this operation. Walsh looked around the diner frantically, searching for support from the other operatives. But Sarah could see that doubt was spreading through the room like a virus. The fake customers were looking at each other uncertainly, their confidence in the mission's justification shaken by the confrontation they had just witnessed. "You fools," Walsh snarled, her true nature finally exposed. Do you think the truth matters? Do you think anyone will believe the word of a rogue operative over the official reports? Phoenix dies here today, one way or another. She reached for a weapon, but Sarah was already moving. 7 years of serving coffee and pie hadn't dulled her reflexes, hadn't diminished the deadly skills that had made her a legend in the shadows. She vaulted over the counter with fluid grace, her body remembering movements that had been drilled into muscle memory through years of brutal training. The diner erupted into chaos as the carefully planned operation collapsed into confusion and violence. The SEALs were caught between conflicting orders and conflicting loyalties, unsure who was the enemy and who was the victim. The fake customers revealed their true nature as backup operatives, but they were also uncertain about their mission parameters now that their commander had been exposed as potentially corrupt. Sarah moved through the chaos like a ghost, using her intimate knowledge of the diner's layout to her advantage. She had spent 7 years learning every corner, every hiding place, every potential weapon in the building. The commercial kitchen became her fortress, the industrial equipment became her arsenal, and the woman who had tried to forget how to kill remembered everything in the space of heartbeats. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about truth, about justice, about ensuring that the real criminals faced consequences for their actions. Sarah had the evidence to expose Walsh and her illegal program, but she needed to survive long enough to get that evidence to people who could act on it. The battle for Maple Grove Diner had begun, and the small-town waitress who had served coffee and pie for 7 years was gone forever. In her place stood Agent Phoenix, and she was fighting not just for her life, but for the soul of the country she had sworn to protect, even when that country had forgotten how to protect her. The truth was finally being revealed, but the cost of that revelation was going to be measured in blood and sacrifice. The woman who had tried to find peace in a small town was about to discover that some battles could never be escaped, only delayed until the moment when running was no longer an option. The smoke from the flashbang grenades was still clearing when Commander Jake Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of his career. Through the haze and confusion of the diner battle, he had watched Agent Phoenix and Director Walsh face off with weapons drawn, and he had seen something in the supposed traitor's eyes that convinced him beyond any doubt that she was telling the truth. Walsh's desperate attempt to eliminate Phoenix rather than allow her evidence to be examined had revealed everything Morrison needed to know about who the real enemy was. The flash drive containing the Blackwater files had survived the chaos, passed from Phoenix to Morrison during a brief moment when Walsh's operatives were regrouping. Morrison had secured it in his tactical vest, knowing that the intelligence it contained would either vindicate Phoenix completely or damn them all for treason. But his gut instincts, honed by 15 years of special operations, told him that the woman who had served coffee in this small town for 7 years was not the enemy they had been sent to capture. Walsh lay unconscious near the overturned counter, subdued by Phoenix with the kind of non-lethal precision that spoke to her true character. A real traitor, a genuine threat to national security, would have killed Walsh without hesitation. Instead, Phoenix had risked her own life to capture the director alive, ensuring that she would face justice for her crimes rather than escape into martyrdom. The cleanup operation took 14 hours and involved 3 different federal agencies, each one trying to determine exactly what had happened in Maple Grove Diner and who should take responsibility for the aftermath. Morrison found himself at the center of a bureaucratic hurricane, explaining again and again how his team had arrived to capture a supposed traitor, only to discover they had been manipulated into a whistleblower who possessed evidence of massive corruption within the intelligence community. The Blackwater files proved to be even more damaging than Phoenix had suggested. They contained not just evidence of the illegal assassination program, but documentation of financial crimes, constitutional violations, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. The 12 names on the original hit, list were just the beginning. Walsh's program had been responsible for the deaths of over 30 American citizens who had posed threats to various classified operations over the past decade. Phoenix, whose real name turned out to be Dr. Elena Vasquez, was not just a highly trained operative, but also a former military intelligence analyst with advanced degrees in international relations and computer science. Her decision to refuse the assassination orders hadn't been an act of cowardice or betrayal, but the ethical stance of someone who understood better than most what those murders would mean for American democracy. She had walked away from her life, her career, and her identity to prevent herself from becoming a tool of domestic terrorism. The media firestorm that erupted when portions of the Blackwater files were declassified made Watergate look like a minor scandal. Congressional hearings were called, special prosecutors were appointed, and the entire intelligence community found itself under scrutiny that it had managed to avoid for decades. The program that had created Agent Phoenix was disbanded, its leadership prosecuted, and its methods exposed to the kind of public examination that made genuine reform possible. Elena Vasquez, no longer Agent Phoenix and no longer Sarah Chen, found herself in protective custody while the investigations proceeded. The safe house where she was kept bore no resemblance to the cozy apartment above Maple Grove Diner, but she discovered that the skills she had learned during her 7 years in Millbrook were more valuable than any of her former training. Ability to connect with people, to care about their problems, to find meaning in simple acts of service, had given her something that her years as an operative had never provided: peace of mind. Commander Morrison visited her regularly during the months of testimony and legal proceedings. He had become something of a hero himself, the military officer who had chosen truth over orders, who had recognized corruption even when it came wrapped in the flag and justified by national security. But he credited Elena with teaching him the most important lesson of his career: that sometimes the most patriotic act is to refuse an order, and sometimes the greatest service to your country is to expose its crimes. The trials that followed reshaped the landscape of American intelligence operations. Director Walsh was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with 6 other senior officials who had participated in the illegal program. Dozens of lower-level operatives received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation, and the entire system of oversight for covert operations was restructured to prevent similar abuses in the future. Elena testified before Congress. In closed session, her identity still protected, but her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen the intelligence community from the inside and understood both its necessity and its dangers. Her testimony led to the creation of new whistleblower protections for intelligence personnel, new oversight mechanisms for covert operations, and new legal frameworks for holding intelligence officials accountable for their actions. The town of Millbrook struggled to understand what had happened in their quiet community. The revelation that many of their neighbors had been federal operatives conducting a 7-year surveillance operation shattered their sense of safety and trust. Some residents felt violated by the deception, angry that their town had been turned into an elaborate stage set without their knowledge or consent. Others felt proud that their community had provided refuge for someone who had sacrificed everything to protect American values. The real residents who had been evacuated during the operation returned to find their town forever changed. The diner where Elena had worked was closed indefinitely, too damaged by the battle and too associated with the scandal to continue operating normally. The building stood empty for months, a reminder of the extraordinary events that had unfolded within its walls. But gradually, the community began to heal. A group of local residents purchased the diner building and converted it into a community center dedicated to supporting veterans and whistleblowers who needed safe haven while transitioning to civilian life. They named it the Elena Vasquez Center for courage and truth, honoring the woman who had shown them that sometimes the most Ordinary-looking people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of bravery. Elena herself struggled with the transition from her secret life to her new public role as a symbol of governmental accountability. The notoriety made it impossible for her to return to the kind of anonymous existence she had treasured in Millbrook. But she discovered that visibility could be its own form of service. She began working with organizations that supported intelligence community whistleblowers, helping others navigate the legal and personal challenges of speaking truth to power. The book she eventually wrote about her experiences became a bestseller, not because of its sensational revelations, but because of its thoughtful examination of the moral complexities facing those who serve in the shadows. She donated all the proceeds to families of intelligence personnel who had been killed or injured in legitimate operations, acknowledging that not all secrets were dirty and that some classified work genuinely protected American interests. Commander Morrison found his career transformed by the events at Maple Grove Diner. Instead of being punished for defying orders, he was promoted and given responsibility for developing new training programs that emphasized ethical decision-making under pressure. The military had learned from the scandal that following orders blindly could be just as dangerous as refusing them capriciously, and Morrison became the architect of reforms that would prevent future commanders from being manipulated into illegal operations. The broader intelligence community underwent the most comprehensive reform in its history. New legal frameworks were established to protect legitimate whistleblowers while still maintaining necessary secrecy for ongoing operations. Congressional oversight was strengthened, judicial review was expanded, and internal accountability mechanisms were created to identify and address problems before they could metastasize into full-blown scandals. Elena remained in contact with some of the real residents of Millbrook, the people she had genuinely cared about during her 7 years, as Sarah Chen. Tom Bradley, who had indeed been the mail carrier he appeared to be, sent her regular updates about life in the town. Mrs. Henderson, the real elderly widow whose identity had been stolen by Walsh's operatives, became a frequent correspondent, sharing news about her grandchildren and asking Elena's advice about dealing with the aftermath of the surveillance operation. The young mother with twin boys, Lisa, struggled with the revelation that the woman who had been so kind to her children had been living under a false identity. But over time, she came to understand that Elena's kindness had been genuine, even if her name had been fabricated. The person who had remembered the boys' birthdays and worried about their scraped knees had been real, even if the circumstances of her presence in Millbrook had been built on lies. Elena's relationship with the truth became complicated in ways she had never anticipated. She had spent 7 years living a lie in order to escape a larger truth, and now she was being celebrated for exposing secrets that others had wanted to keep hidden. The irony was not lost on her that the woman who had been forced to become someone else in order to survive had ultimately found her greatest purpose in refusing to let others do the same thing to her. The psychological impact of her ordeal took years to fully process. Elena worked with therapists who specialized in treating intelligence personnel, people who understood the unique challenges of living with secrets and the difficulty of maintaining authentic relationships when your entire identity might be fabricated. She learned to forgive herself for the deceptions she had been forced to maintain and to value the genuine connections she had made despite the artificial circumstances of her life in Millbrook. The legal settlement she eventually received from the government was substantial, reflecting both the damage done to her life and the value of the intelligence she had provided about corruption within the system. But Elena discovered that money could not restore the sense of safety and anonymity she had lost. Fame, even the kind that came from being on the right side of history, was its own form of prison. She used her resources to establish a foundation that provided legal and financial support to intelligence community whistleblowers and their families. The foundation operated on the principle that protecting those who exposed wrongdoing was essential to preventing future corruption, and it became a model for similar organizations in other countries dealing with their own intelligence scandals. The international implications of the Blackwater files extended far beyond American borders. Foreign governments demanded explanations for operations that had been conducted on their soil without their knowledge, and several international intelligence sharing agreements had to be renegotiated to restore trust that had been damaged by the revelations. Elena found herself testifying before foreign parliamentary committees and international tribunals, explaining not just what had happened, but why it had been necessary to expose it. The technology that had enabled Walsh's surveillance of Millbrook became the subject of intense scrutiny and regulation. The revelation that an entire town could be monitored and infiltrated so thoroughly led to new legal protections for domestic surveillance and stricter oversight of intelligence operations on American soil. Civil liberties organizations used the Millbrook case as a rallying point for broader reforms to surveillance law and intelligence accountability. Elena's expertise in both intelligence operations and computer science made her a valuable consultant for the reforms that followed. She helped design new systems for reporting and investigating allegations of intelligence community misconduct, drawing on her experience as both an operative and a victim to create mechanisms that would protect legitimate secrets while exposing illegal activities. The personal cost of her heroism remained high. Elena could never again live the kind of quiet, anonymous life she had treasured as Sarah Chen. Her face was too well known, her story too famous, her identity too public for her to disappear into normalcy. But she discovered that there were different kinds of peace, and that the satisfaction of knowing she had done the right thing could be its own form of contentment. Commander Morrison and Elena developed a friendship that transcended their professional relationship, bonded by their shared experience of choosing principle over convenience. He often visited her at the small house she eventually purchased in Virginia, bringing news from the military and updates on the ongoing reforms. Their conversations ranged from the technical details of intelligence operations to the philosophical questions about duty, loyalty, and the price of truth. The legacy of Maple Grove Diner extended far beyond the specific scandal that had made it famous. It became a symbol of the principle that ordinary people in ordinary places could play extraordinary roles in protecting democracy, that courage could be found behind a lunch counter as easily as on a battlefield, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with evidence and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth. Elena Vasquez, who had begun as Agent Phoenix and transformed into Sarah Chen before becoming herself again, understood that identity was more fluid and complex than she had ever imagined. The skills that had made her a deadly operative had also made her a caring waitress, and the compassion she had learned while serving coffee had given her the strength to serve justice. She was all of these people, and none of them, shaped by her experiences but not defined by them, free to choose who she would become next. The small-town waitress who had hidden a deadly secret had become something more dangerous than any spy or assassin. She had become a symbol of the idea that truth was more powerful than secrecy, that conscience was more important than orders, and that sometimes the greatest service to your country was to force it to live up to its own highest ideals. The impact of her choice would ripple through history, changing not just the intelligence community, but the entire relationship between government and citizen, between secret and truth, between the powerful and those brave enough to hold them accountable. 5 years after the events that transformed Maple Grove Diner into a symbol of courage and truth, Elena Vasquez stood before the bronze memorial that had been erected in the center of Millbrook's town square. The inscription reads simply, "To those who choose truth over comfort, courage over silence, and justice over convenience." Below those words were the names of 37 American citizens who had been murdered by Director Walsh's illegal program. People whose only crime had been asking inconvenient questions about government activities that should never have been authorized. The annual Truth and Reconciliation Festival had become Millbrook's most important community event, drawing visitors from across the nation who came to pay their respects to the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. Elena served as the keynote speaker each year, but this 5th anniversary felt different. This would be her final speech in Millbrook, her last public appearance before retiring from her role as the face of intelligence community reform. The crowd that gathered in the town square represented a cross-section of American society. There were families of intelligence operatives who had been killed in legitimate operations, their presence a reminder that not all classified work was corrupt. There were journalists who had been targeted by Walsh's program but survived to tell their stories. There were members of Congress who had fought for the reforms that followed the scandal. And there were ordinary citizens who understood that their freedom depended on people being willing to speak truth to power. Elena looked out at the faces in the crowd and saw reflections of her own journey from darkness into light. Commander Jake Morrison sat in the front row with his wife and children, the man who had chosen to trust her instincts over his orders, now serving as the Director of Ethical Operations for Special Forces Command. Beside him sat Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the trauma therapist who had helped Elena process the psychological damage of living with deadly secrets for so many years. In the back of the crowd, Elena spotted several faces she recognized from her years in Millbrook. Tom Bradley, the mail carrier whose identity had never been compromised, had become the town's unofficial historian, documenting the true story of what had happened during those 7 years of surveillance. Mrs. Henderson, the real elderly widow, had written a memoir about discovering that her neighbor had been impersonated by federal agents, a story that had become a bestseller in its own right. Lisa, the young mother whose twin boys were now old enough to understand some of what had happened, had become an advocate for government transparency, serving on oversight committees that monitored intelligence operations. Her children, now 10 years old, had grown up knowing that the nice waitress who used to remember their birthdays had actually been a hero fighting for their freedom. As Elena stepped to the podium, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once been Agent Phoenix, who had served her country in the shadows and paid a terrible price for doing what she believed was right, had found a different kind of purpose in the light. The skills that had made her a deadly operative had been transformed into tools for healing and justice. 5 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the square. This town became the center of a storm that exposed corruption at the highest levels of our government. But the real story of Millbrook isn't about conspiracy or betrayal. It's about the power of community, the importance of bearing witness, and the courage required to choose what's right over what's easy. She paused, looking out at the faces that had become so familiar over the years of commemoration and reflection. These people had taught her something that all her training as an operative had never addressed, that the greatest strength came not from the ability to keep secrets, but from the willingness to share the truth. When I first came to this town, I was running from my past, trying to become someone new, someone clean, someone who could sleep at night without seeing the faces of people I had killed in service to my country. I thought that if I could just blend in, just become ordinary, I could escape the violence and moral complexity of my former life. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued, the words flowing from years of reflection and hard-won wisdom. But what I learned in those 7 years behind the counter of Maple Grove Diner is that there is no such thing as ordinary people. Every person who walked through that door had their own struggles, their own secrets, their own quiet acts of courage. The mother working 3 jobs to provide for her children, the veteran dealing with invisible wounds, the teenager dreaming of a future beyond these farmlands. They were all heroes in their own way. The crowd listened with the kind of attention that comes from recognizing truth in unexpected places. Elena had become known for her ability to find profound meaning in simple moments, to see the extraordinary in the everyday experiences that most people took for granted. The surveillance operation that brought me to Millbrook was designed to contain me, to keep me isolated and monitored while the architects of corruption continued their work. But what they didn't understand is that you can't contain truth indefinitely. You can hide it, you can bury it, you can dress it up as something else, but eventually it finds a way to surface. Elena looked directly at Commander Morrison, remembering the moment when he had chosen to trust her over his orders, when a career military officer had decided that his oath to the Constitution meant more than his loyalty to his superiors. That single decision had changed the course of American history, proving that individual choices could have consequences far beyond what anyone might imagine. The reforms that followed our confrontation in the diner have made our intelligence community more accountable, more ethical, and ultimately more effective. When operatives know they can report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation, when oversight committees have real power to investigate misconduct, when the law applies equally to those who work in classified programs, we are all safer. The changes Elena described had not come easily. The intelligence community had resisted reform at every step, arguing that transparency would compromise operational security and endanger national interests. But the evidence contained in the Blackwater files had been so damning, the corruption so extensive, that resistance had been futile. The choice had been between reform and complete dissolution of the programs involved. Today, intelligence operatives serve under new rules that protect both national security and constitutional rights. Whistleblower protections ensure that those who expose wrongdoing are rewarded rather than punished. Oversight mechanisms prevent the kind of unchecked power that allowed Director Walsh's program to operate for so many years. And perhaps most importantly, we have established the principle that following orders is never an excuse for violating the law or the Constitution. Elena thought about the hundreds of intelligence personnel she had worked with over the years. Since the scandal broke, many of them had initially viewed her as a traitor who had damaged their profession. But time had proven that her actions had actually strengthened their ability to serve their country effectively. When the public trusted the intelligence community, when Congress provided proper oversight, when the law protected both operatives and civilians, everyone was better served. But the most important lesson of Millbrook isn't about intelligence, operations, or government accountability. It's about the power of seeing each other clearly, of recognizing the humanity in every person we encounter, of understanding that we are all capable of both great evil and great good, depending on the choices we make. She gestured toward the memorial behind her, the bronze plaque that honored both the victims of Walsh's program and the courage of those who had exposed it. The people whose names are inscribed on this memorial died because someone decided they were expendable, that their questions were inconvenient, that their lives mattered less than protecting institutional secrets. But their deaths were not in vain if we learn from them, if we commit ourselves to the principle that no secret is worth more than a human life. Elena's voice carried the weight of personal experience, the authority of someone who had lived on both sides of the moral equation she was describing. She had been trained to see targets rather than people, to prioritize mission success over individual conscience, to believe that the ends always justified the means. But 7 years of serving coffee and pie had taught her that every person had value, that every life contained stories worth preserving, that every choice carried moral weight. The woman I was before I came to Millbrook was very good at her job. Agent Phoenix could infiltrate enemy organizations, eliminate threats to national security, and complete missions that others couldn't imagine attempting. But she was also hollow. Inside, disconnected from the very humanity she was supposed to be protecting. The admission carried a vulnerability that Elena had rarely shown in her public appearances. She had become known for her strength, her courage, her unwavering commitment to justice. But the truth was more complex, more human than the heroic narrative that had grown up around her actions. Sarah Chen, the waitress who served you coffee and remembered your birthdays, was in many ways more real than Agent Phoenix had ever been. She cared about people's daily struggles, celebrated their small victories, mourned their losses. She found meaning in simple acts of service, joy, and uncomplicated human connection. The skills I had learned as an operative helped me blend in. But the person I became while living among you taught me what I was really fighting for. Elena looked out at the crowd and saw nods of recognition from people who understood the transformative power of community, who had experienced their own journeys from isolation to connection. The story of Millbrook had resonated around the world precisely because it was ultimately a human story, a tale of redemption and courage that transcended the specific details of espionage and corruption. When Director Walsh and her team finally came for me, they thought they were capturing a rogue operative who had stolen classified information. What they actually found was someone who had discovered that the greatest intelligence of all is understanding what truly matters, what principles are worth defending, what sacrifices are worth making. The battle in Maple Grove Diner had lasted less than an hour, but its consequences were still reverberating through American society. The reforms that followed had prevented other scandals, protected other whistleblowers, and restored public trust in institutions that had been compromised by corruption. But more than that, the story had inspired ordinary people to recognize their own power to make a difference. Each of you has the potential to be a whistleblower in your own life, to speak up when you see wrongdoing, to choose truth over convenience, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. You don't need to be a trained operative or have access to classified information to make a difference. You just need to be willing to see clearly and act courageously. Elena's message had evolved over the 5 years she had been speaking publicly about her experiences. Initially, her focus had been on intelligence community reform and government accountability. But over time, she had come to understand that the real power of her story lay in its demonstration of individual agency, the proof that one person's choices could create ripple effects that changed the world. The Elena Vasquez Center for Courage and Truth, which now occupies the building where Maple Grove Diner once stood, has helped over 3,000 people navigate the challenges of speaking up about wrongdoing in their own organizations. Some were government employees exposing waste and corruption. Others were corporate workers revealing environmental violations or safety hazards. Still others were ordinary citizens documenting police misconduct or educational fraud. The center had become a model for similar organizations around the world, providing legal support, psychological counseling, and financial assistance to people who chose to expose wrongdoing despite personal risk. Elena served on its board, but had stepped back from day-to-day operations, recognizing that the movement had grown beyond any single individual's ability to control or direct. What unites all these whistleblowers is not their access to secrets or their professional expertise, but their willingness to put principle above self-interest. They understood that some truths are too important to keep hidden, that some injustices demand action regardless of personal cost. Elena thought about the letters she received from around the world, from people who had been inspired by her story to take action in their own lives. A nurse in Germany who had exposed inadequate safety protocols during the pandemic. A teacher in Brazil who had documented corruption in educational funding. A factory worker in Bangladesh who had revealed dangerous working conditions. Each of them had faced retaliation, but each had also created positive change that benefited countless others. As I prepare to step back from public speaking and return to a more private life, I want to leave you with the understanding that heroism isn't about having special training or access to classified information. It's about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to protect the values and institutions that make freedom possible. The announcement that this would be her final public appearance in Millbrook created a stir in the crowd, but Elena had made her decision carefully. 5 years of being the public face of government accountability had taken their toll, and she was ready to find a new way to serve. The foundation would continue its work, the reforms would continue to evolve, and the principle of transparency would continue to strengthen. But Alina herself was ready for a different kind of life. The woman who will leave Millbrook today is neither Agent Phoenix nor Sarah Chen, but someone new, someone shaped by both experiences but defined by neither. I carry with me the skills I learned as an operative, the compassion I discovered as a waitress, and the wisdom that comes from understanding that identity is something we choose, rather than something that's imposed upon us. Alina stepped back from the podium and looked out at the crowd one final time. These people had given her something more valuable than any medal or commendation. They had given her a sense of belonging, a community that accepted her for who she chose to be rather than who she had been forced to become. The relationships she had built in Millbrook, even those based initially on deception, had taught her the meaning of authentic human connection. As the crowd dispersed and people began to make their way home, Alina lingered in the town square, memorizing the details of a place that had become sacred to her. The bronze memorial gleamed in the late afternoon sun, a permanent reminder of the price of corruption and the value of courage. The streets where she had walked for 7 years as Sarah Chen stretched out in all directions, carrying the memories of a simpler time when her greatest concern was whether the coffee was fresh and the pie was warm. Commander Morrison approached her as she stood there, his own expression mixing sadness at her departure with pride in what they had accomplished together. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of their shared experience. Alina considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret the people who died, because I wasn't brave enough to act sooner. I regret the years I spent believing that following orders was more important than following my conscience. But I don't regret becoming Sarah Chen, and I don't regret the choice to expose the truth. Those experiences made me who I am today." Morrison nodded, understanding the complexity of her feelings. His own journey from unquestioning soldier to ethical leader had been shaped by their encounter in the diner, by the moment when he had chosen to trust a supposed traitor over his commanding officers. "What's next for you?" Alina smiled, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. "I'm going to disappear again, but this time on my own terms. No new identity, no elaborate cover story, just a quiet life where I can use what I've learned to help people in small ways, personal ways. Maybe I'll teach, maybe I'll write, maybe I'll just find a new place where I can serve coffee and remember people's birthdays." The prospect of anonymity, of choosing her own path rather than having it chosen for her, felt like the greatest freedom Alina had ever known. She had spent her entire adult life being defined by external forces, first as Agent Phoenix, then as the hidden Sarah Chen, then as the public symbol of government accountability. Now, for the first time, she could simply be herself. As the sun set over Millbrook, Alina Vasquez walked away from the town square and toward whatever came next. Behind her, the memorial stood as a testament to the power of individual courage, the importance of institutional accountability, and the eternal struggle between secrecy and truth. Ahead of her lay the possibility of a life where she could choose her own battles, make her own rules, and serve others without the weight of global consequences on her shoulders. The small-town waitress who had hidden a deadly secret had become something more powerful than any spy or assassin. She had become a catalyst for change, a symbol of hope, and a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose courage over comfort. Her story would continue to inspire others long after she had faded back into the anonymity she craved, proving that the greatest impact often comes not from the shadows where secrets are kept, but from the light where truth can flourish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.